Last week, a certain Canadian figure who was once quite influential in politics but has now faded into relative obscurity, Stockwell issued a public statement regarding the Ceuta crisis unfolding in a Spanish enclave in Africa that I find to be so utterly disgraceful in its dishonesty, in its distortion, and in the prejudice it shows, that I figured it's actually a responsibility binding on anyone who knows of the matters he speaks of and mischaracterizes to rebuke it for the lies that it is. So for starters, I want to actually give a brief overview of who Stockwell actually was. He began his political career arguably in the 1980s, where he was a Christian activist against government involvement and regulation in private Christian schools when it came to the province of Alberta. Now, as his career furthers into politics, he ends up in the early 2000s amidst a kind of schism within the Conservative Party, heading Canadian Alliance. But eventually the party was rather soon dissolved. He also served as an MP of Okanagan-Coquihalla riding, and he also occupied several roles as minister in Alberta, first of Labor, then Social Services and Treasury Board. Under the Harper administration now for the federal Canadian government, he became Minister of Public Safety, International Trade, and then the Treasury Board yet again. But by 2011, he announced his retirement from politics, and this retirement was more so with regards to holding a governmental position, as he was still very much involved in corporate political work, be it Stockwell Day Connex, which was his kind of consultancy and government relations firm that also included a great deal of unofficial lobbying, him being a board member of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, board member of TELUS, and AWZ Ventures, which is a private investment firm, specifically the kind that is founded by a Canadian Israeli under the name of Yaron Ashkenazi, who shows his fondness for Israel through active cooperation and investment in the development of Israeli technology, and very much the kind that pertains to matters of security and defense, which, if you know a thing or two about Israel, is quite offensive in nature. Also surveillance, AI, in short, anything that has to do with the automation and perpetration of the Gazan genocide. It's also worth noting that a certain Stephen Harper was also, and still is, a partner and president of advisory committee at this very firm. So before reacting to this video, I want to address what is its central topic, the Ceuta crisis. In the briefest terms possible, the Ceuta crisis was the illegal entry of tens of thousands of migrants, mainly from Morocco, into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta, which borders Morocco proper and is situated within the African continent. Now, this crisis has a variety of causes, in part poor Spanish policymaking and response to it, and on the other, Moroccan opportunism and deliberate negligence. On July 8th, the Spanish Supreme Court issues a ruling that migrants intercepted at sea cannot be simply returned to their countries like Morocco, but must instead be brought to reception centers. This results in a more rewarding outcome for migrants who attempt to swim past the barricades around Ceuta in order to enter illegally. And so, the result, naturally, is that attempts go from only around 2 per day in the month before to around a dozen, to even a couple hundred near the end of July. This is also compounded by a social media campaign, one that also involves a great deal of misinformation. On one hand, it's simply reports of people saying that they were not returned straight to Morocco. On the other, there's also people spreading the rumor that on the king's birthday, entry will simply be permissible, and that there won't be any kind of interception whatsoever. And another thing worth remarking is that this crisis is preceded, at least the acme of the crisis is preceded by a rapprochement between Algeria and Spain, Algeria being Morocco's longtime rival. Now, by the 30th of July, which is also the King of Morocco's birthday, several thousand people enter. And this results in a response from the mayor-president of Ceuta, Vivas, calling in for a state of emergency and asking Madrid and Sanchez's administration for more law enforcement and for military assistance. Now, Sanchez rejects these calls, probably in part because he did not consider it grave enough, and there was a broader discomfort to act against the Supreme Court ruling. But he also specifically cites that this responsibility regarding the border is also one that very much is binding onto Morocco, and Morocco is failing its own end of the bargain in this crisis. Though he promptly changes his mind by July 31st, where the crisis reaches an unprecedented peak, with as many as 80,000 migrants attempting to enter the enclave that only has around 84,000 inhabitants to begin with, meaning the population practically doubled overnight. To further compound the gravity of this crisis, over 100 people actually drown in these attempts. And many still are injured and incapacitated by the time they reach Ceuta's shore. This prompts Sanchez to arrive to the enclave on that very day. He issues a public statement saying that it is a violation of Spain's territorial sovereignty and that it was engendered by smuggling organizations. Now, worth noting is Morocco's remarkable absence in this affair. Its law enforcement and border patrol simply allows thousands upon thousands of migrants to go to the shore and to swim around completely unimpeded when they actually reach those very border posts. And I believe that it is not merely the result of negligence, but actual opportunism, and I will explain this later down the line. Now, the Spanish response is that by the 1st of August, around 48,000 are returned through a military presence and increased law enforcement. It's also worth noting that, putting aside the sheer efficacy of these returns, they are also done humanely. There aren't reports of widespread abuses of the migrants upon their detention and return, and those who are facing medical problems are tended to and treated, and those who cannot go to Morocco because they do not have proper documentation, which consists of around 10,000 out of the total 80,000, stay and are left there for processing. Now, this results in essentially the 70,000 total Moroccan presence being returned to Morocco, which is a kind of reversal of the Supreme Court ruling, but a necessary one, realizing that putting this ruling into practice is, simply put, a terrible idea. Now, worth addressing is Moroccan involvement in this crisis. Now, here is why I'm not quite convinced that the Moroccan involvement, or lack thereof, in this crisis was not so accidental but deliberate. Firstly, it does coincide with these kind of rufflings of feathers with the rapprochement between Spain and Algeria. And it is also the culmination of a long-standing dispute, territorial dispute, that Morocco has over Spain with regards to the status of Ceuta and Melilla. In prior occasions, there have been many diplomatic tensions between Spain and Morocco, specifically concerning Western Sahara. Now, when it comes to this specific tension over Western Sahara, Spain is quite sympathetic to those who are waging a conflict of resistance against Morocco, that being the Polisario Front. this culminated in 2021, where Spain actually agreed to admit the head of the Polisario Front into one of its hospitals, prompting a Moroccan response of allowing 10,000 migrants to once again break into Ceuta. And this is a curious matter, right? It shows that there is very much a weaponization of movements of population on behalf of Morocco in order to deal with diplomatic tensions with its foes, and also in order to contest territorial claims. Because it's actually worth noting that the very occupation of Western Sahara actually began with the Green March in 1975, where over 300,000 Moroccan civilians, unarmed, walked into the territory waving green flags, preaching of Islam and brotherhood, only to essentially initiate a terrible occupation which has subjugated and afflicted the Sahrawis for over 4 decades. And this long-standing precedent, which is also compounded with the rapprochement with Algeria and the overall contestations of territorial claims, also compounded by the fact that Morocco has more impunity in the eyes of the United States now, and that the U.S. House Appropriations Committee even tacitly affirmed, to some extent at least, Moroccan territorial claims over Ceuta and Melilla, saying that they are territories within Morocco. I can only think that there was a great deal of intentionality involved behind the disengagement that Moroccan forces showed up until August 1st in the aftermath of the culmination. And it's also worth noting that in the aftermath of the culmination, the response from them was quite abusive toward Moroccan migrants themselves. There was footage leaked of them pelting migrants with stones and beating them viciously, which furthers my wonders as to what was the intent behind the whole crisis, or if this is some kind of punitive treatment of them for not staying. I don't know. I guess this is to the point of conjecture, but it is worth appreciating these bizarrities in the Moroccan response to the crisis. Bismillah. Now, what is remarkable is that from August onwards, by the very first day, the reaction by media all around the world, especially in the West, is very much intent on presenting Spanish policy as responsible for this crisis. Now, I think there's a lot of truth to this, but let's just say that the way it is characterized by them in particular is very uncharitable. For example, they very much focalize on Sanchez's immigration-friendly policies as the sole factor for this. They present his unwillingness to respond as being much more long-lasting than it actually was, in the sense that as soon as the entries reached tens of thousands, he did respond, and he very much condemned it, and he actually walked the talk insofar as the military and police response was concerned. And yet they very much undersold that fact. In fact, they outright omitted it a lot of the time and only focalized on the actual entries that occurred on the 31st and 30th. Now, this campaign was quite coordinated and involved more or less the same talking points, and was foremost led by the right and the far right, politicians and media alike, in the United Kingdom, Russia, Italy, the United States, of course, and also, as we'll cover today, in Canada. Now, from their angle, the rhetoric was primarily one of being anti-immigrant and condemning Spain for its, let's say, immigrant-friendly policies, and also calling on to things like the prospect of Muslim invasion into the rest of Europe, fear-mongering about how these migrants were, having a spillover into other regions of Europe, which is ridiculous because not a single migrant made it past Ceuta, especially considering they would need to go through checkpoints and have proper documentation in order to do that, right? There's a whole kind of sea that makes this prospect very difficult. And yeah, now there is also another aspect to this media campaign, which was led especially by Israel, and also, of course, by Morocco, which took upon the mantle of, let's just say, a call for the decolonization of Ceuta and Melilla and just Spanish enclaves in general in and around Morocco, which is very much, at least on Israel's behalf, a kind of way to reward Morocco over its own steadfastness in these last years in, let's just say, at the very least tolerating, if not supporting Israel, and further frolicking around with the United States. And also as a means of punishing Spain for doing the exact opposite, right? By adopting a newer foreign policy that is quite anti-Zionist and also quite unkeen on collaborating with the US in its own campaign currently unfolding in the Middle East. Now, it's time to start the video by Stockwell Day, which is yet another theater, I guess the Canadian theater to this smear campaign. So, at last, let's begin watching and reacting to this video.
What's happening in Spain with their invasion, they brought upon themselves a...
So right away he places the sole locus of culpability onto Spain.
The same thing could happen to Canada.
Could it, though, considering we're dealing with an enclave that's in Africa, and that borders a country that is full of people dying to actually emigrate from there, unlike the state of Canada, right, which is surrounded by two oceans and the Arctic, and shares only a land border with the United States, which does not have such a huge efflux of migrants.
People need to get a grip and send the signal out, send it to our elected people. Canada is not wide open.
Yeah, but that's precisely because of its natural barriers.
This invasion that is happening in Spain is something that that country brought upon themselves. Their leadership, their prime minister, signaled to the world that they don't care if they get invaded, if there's mass over immigration, open immigration, that they're never going to send back people who are there illegally.
So, I don't know about you, but when I hear a head of state say that a certain crisis pertaining to mass migration is a violation of that country's territorial sovereignty, and that they actually respond to this very crisis that they're calling out with the deployment of the military and further law enforcement that results in its very first day with the successful return of over 48,000 migrants, it really does not sound to me like someone who simply believes that Spain is open and up for grabs, nor someone who's unwilling to actually return those who have entered illegally.
When a country sends a signal that they don't care if they get invaded by massive immigration without anybody being checked, without anybody being deported if they're criminals, when you...
That's just an open-ended lie, right? There were deportations at an unprecedented scale and with unprecedented efficacy. It's actually something that a lot of countries could learn from.
You send that signal, your country is on the way to disaster. When you send a signal that anybody can come in, even when their values clash with yours.
Now you see what he's building up to, right? He's going to talk about how it's not even just that they're entering illegally, but that they come from a background that Mr. Stockwell Day is not so fond of.
Even when they don't support the values that made Canada strong, you send that signal that people are welcome to come swarming in on that basis, then Canada also will be doomed.
This simply can't befall Canada, right? Because the bulk of the efflux that makes the migration that we see throughout the world, frankly, comes from Africa and Asia. And such efflux would need to be brought onto the Canadian shore through boats that are traversing over the entirety of the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean, oftentimes arriving to South America and needing to traverse through the entirety of these perilous continents, only to arrive into the United States and then persevere in even further onto the Canadian border, right? That is far from an easy undertaking. It's a lot harder than just swimming over and bypassing some barricades to walk into Ceuta. This is why I find this conflation ridiculous. Also, another big factor is the fact that Ceuta is a minuscule enclave. It can't even be seen on a world map, whereas Canada is the second biggest country on Earth. Ceuta is an enclave that is home to only 84,000 inhabitants, whereas Canada is home to 40 million. And these very proportional factors play a huge role in our capacity to even handle such influx and also to deal with it accordingly, be it through returns or reception, right? And so, yeah, it just does not map onto Canadian affairs. It's not pertinent to us. It's not a relevant crisis to us. And yet, he's trying to make it look like this crisis, this tragedy that unfolded on the African continent is somehow so much nearer to home than it seems, when it simply isn't.
There's this crazy notion out there that all cultures are equal. All cultures are not equal. Islam believes as foundational, I'm not talking about the so-called extremists, because a lot of Islamic teaching is extreme.
This is a grand attempt at exegizing and deciphering the core tenets of Islam, right? Because he's saying these are not extremist views or extremist interpretations. These are the views inherent to Islam. His point is to essentially propose that you do not need to be a radical Muslim in order to ascribe to any of these points. You just need to be your everyday Joe Schmo, or I guess Abdullah Muhammad, in order to actually believe in these views. And let's just say he's going to butcher what he thinks are views core to Islam.
When compared to Western teaching.
Here too, he already makes an erroneous claim because he's juxtaposing Islamic teaching with Western teaching, as though they're just these fundamentally opposed forces. This is what you see a lot of Islamophobes do in the West. This is also what you see actually a lot of more radical Qutbist Muslims do, which is this kind of depiction of the Western Hemisphere. They just cannot be compatible. They have nothing in common in their traditions, in their backgrounds, nor in their trajectories. And it's such a ridiculous assertion. It comes from such a underappreciation, if not ignorance, of the interactions that the Islamic world, and I guess for most of Europe at the time, Christendom, had with one another, especially in the medieval times. The Islamic intellectual traditions were very much influential onto Western and Christian intellectual traditions, especially in the domains of philosophy, be it theology and metaphysics and cosmology, as well as the sciences, be it medicine and algebra and astrology at the time, which was a kind of science. On the other hand, you have an ignorance of the sheer extent to which Islam spread in the Western Hemisphere. There were already Western Muslims within the Ummah since over a millennium ago, right? And this presence continued. It was extant. It continued especially in the Balkans to this very day, where you find people leading veritably Western ways of life, and yet holding steadfastly onto Islam nevertheless, right? And this is something that people simply omit and dismiss when they're depicting this narrative of Islam and the West as being somehow akin to oil and water, right?
In Canada, we don't believe women are second class. In Canada, we don't believe that you can keep women from voting. In Canada, we don't believe that if somebody commits a terrorist act, they're going to go to heaven and meet 72 virgins there.
So, his listing of the ideas core to Islam is the belief that women are second class, which is quite the misreading into any significant, authentic Islamic scripture. Then it is the proposition that they must be excluded from voting, even though even the very jurisprudence of voting is a very recent thing for the Islamic world. We simply did not really have any democracies up until the early 1900s. And then he raises the point of Islamic terrorism, of course, which would also mean that if this was a core idea, this would mean that, every ordinary Muslim would have to be fond of and conciliatory towards the perpetration of terrorist attacks against civilians at our very homes, be it here in Canada or in our countries of origin, which is a ridiculous proposition, especially considering that it is actually very much a source of turmoil in a lot of Muslim majority countries.
In Canada, we believe everybody gets a vote. These things are very different than where Islam is practiced around the world. And
he's right for this very small segment that it is true that the practice of democratic rule is much rarer in most Muslim majority countries than it is here in the West. And frankly, the prevalence of autocracies and even the prevalence of a lot of these ills that he named before, which, like I said before, are far from tenets of Islam, are actually reasons why a lot of Muslims emigrate from these countries to begin with and want to establish a life here in Canada, right? It is actually for a lot of us this yearning for stability, this yearning for a kind of environment where there isn't a prevalence of violence, where blood isn't cheap, and where women aren't treated as second class, right? A lot of these things actually do play even roles in our affinity for this very country that we live in, and yet he's trying to present this as something that is fundamentally conflicting with our faith in Islam.
if we don't make that differentiation, we are going to be in trouble. I can tell you, as Canada's former Minister of Public Safety, responsible for the criminal justice system in terms of how it's applied, if you don't send strong signals that there's going to be strong penalties, that there's going to be strong consequences for people who break the law, especially when they're doing that violently.
His whole solution to all of these issues, be it mass immigration and illegal migration, is to enforce the rule of law, law and order. This is his answer to every major qualm that our countries or countries abroad face. It's such a reductionist understanding of these actual issues afflicting us. It's so clear that the simple fact of increasing our harshness is not going to solve things. Like, there's so many countries where, the perfect example is this very hike in quote-unquote law and order that we're seeing in the United States with ICE activity, having been ramped up so significantly, and with those arbitrary quotas of 1,000 deportations a day, they've been nothing short of catastrophic. They've resulted in nationwide atrocities and abuses and mistakes and deliberate crimes as well. And they haven't done much to mitigate illegal entries. They've only sowed the seeds of terrors throughout the country for all people. And so this idea, this reductionist fantasy that a lot of conservatives unfortunately hold on to, that it is merely a matter of enforcement and austerity, that is the only variable that we actually need to consider when tackling these crises, it's nothing short of fantastical. It doesn't have any bearing on reality. This is not to say that we should be completely open and laissez-faire, and I do think that, for example, the Spanish crisis in Ceuta did have much to do with issues in enforcement at first, but this is just not the sole answer as he makes it seem.
If you don't send a message out that there's no free drugs for everybody on the street, that there's no free, safe shoot-up sites,
Here he's completely derailing, right? He's inserting his qualms that he has with municipal policy regarding the decriminalization of drugs onto his broader point about how rule and law will save Canada from invasion. It doesn't make any sense. It's completely incoherent. This is a matter of municipal policy. Immigration is an overwhelmingly federal matter. I don't even understand what kind of, not even resemblance, what kind of relevance it bears onto this topic. I think it's just his attempt at making a kind of Frankenstein where he can vent about any kind of qualm he has with current centrist and center-left administrations throughout Canada. It just ends up a completely incoherent rant.
These are messages that have to be sent out. If you don't do that, and add on to that wide open and illegal immigration, you invite catastrophe on your own country. People are wondering if there's any hope. Are we going to just fall apart like we're seeing in so many European countries? Of course there's hope. Hope comes from speaking the truth. Yes, speak it in love, but speak it strongly.
So as we can tell, he has failed miserably at both. He's neither spoken the truth, as the great majority of the statements he uttered in this video were either mischaracterizations or were altogether counterfactual. And he clearly did not speak it with love, as he harbors a deep antipathy towards us Muslims and also toward the leftist administration of Spain.
When you speak clearly and you identify to people that they need to think about who they're voting for. Are they voting for people and for policies that weaken a country?
He's right. That's, I can't judge that here. It's just, I think if he actually applied these ideals onto himself and onto Canada, he would, through sincere means, if he were a sincere person, come to the conclusion that perhaps Canada should not be aligning itself with Israeli colonial interests so deeply. But it's clearly not an opinion he holds.
That make a country disintegrate, or are they voting for people and policies that respect the law?
Yeah, I agree, especially international law, right? Especially the enforcement of laws against, crimes against humanity and genocide, right?
That respect legal immigration, that recognizes there's right and wrong. These are the types of things that are going to either make a country be strong and prosper or cause a country to fail.
He's right. It's just that somehow his takeaway from this is that we should send more money to Israel and we should get all the more close to them in their genocidal campaigns. That's a major confound when it comes to the sincerity that a lot of these politicians unfortunately hold in our administrations. So all in all, this is just one of many clips by many public figures, be they politicians, pundits, and propagandists, all throughout the right, that have attempted to disinform people regarding this crisis and regarding any matters which frankly bear any tangentiality to Muslims altogether. And I must say we should expect much more of this in the coming future, as our platform is larger than it ever was, and so is our representation in mainstream politics, meaning that there is an unprecedented impetus in silencing us by those who seek to rid themselves of our voices, if not our presence altogether. And it is a duty binding on all of us to fight against these smears and these propaganda tactics with sincerity, veracity, and attention to detail, like I've attempted here with the coverage of this crisis. I hope to see you all very soon. I hope you do stay strong and stay loud in the face of so much negative and hateful press that we unfortunately are receiving on a daily basis. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.